There comes a point in a man's life when he stops asking if he can trust a woman and starts asking why he kept ignoring the signs that he couldn't. Richard Coleman didn't arrive at that question overnight, and he didn't arrive there angry either, which is what most people would assume if they saw him now, sitting alone at his kitchen table just after sunrise, a quiet house, a cup of black coffee going cold, his phone face down like it no longer had anything to offer him, because from the outside it looks like withdrawal, like disappointment, like something must have gone wrong. But what most people miss is that nothing suddenly went wrong for Richard. This was not one argument, not one breakup, not one moment where everything collapsed. This was years, decades of small moments stacking quietly on top of each other. Moments where he chose patience over clarity, where he explained instead of being understood, where he gave more than he ever got back and called it love, because that's what he had been taught to do. And now, at this stage of his life, something has shifted in a way that cannot be undone, because for the first time, Richard is no longer trying to make things work at any cost. He is trying to understand what those costs actually were, and more importantly, whether they were ever worth paying in the first place. Most people would look at a man like Richard and come to a simple conclusion. They would say he has been hurt, that he is carrying bitterness, that something in him has closed off, because that is the easiest story to tell when a man stops engaging the way he used to. But that story is almost always wrong, and more importantly, it allows everyone around him to avoid a far more uncomfortable truth. Because what looks like distance is often not about pain at all. It is about clarity, and clarity does not come suddenly. It builds slowly, quietly, in the background of a life lived paying attention. Richard did not wake up one morning and decide to pull back. He spent years noticing things he could not unsee. Patterns in conversations, patterns in expectations, patterns in how often he was asked to understand versus how rarely he was understood in return. And for a long time, he ignored those patterns because that is what he had always done. He believed that effort could fix imbalance, that patience could create respect, that loyalty would eventually be recognized and returned. But over time, those beliefs started to feel less like strength and more like a script he had been following without question. And once a man begins to see that he has been following a script that does not serve him, something changes at a level that cannot be reversed, because from that point forward, he is no longer reacting to moments. He is evaluating patterns, and patterns are much harder to ignore once they have been seen clearly. The shift inside Richard did not come from one defining moment. It came from a slow accumulation of awareness that he could no longer turn off. Because once a man begins to understand the internal mechanics of his own behavior, he starts to see how much of it was never truly chosen. Richard began to notice that every time he felt drained after a conversation, every time he walked away feeling slightly smaller, slightly more responsible for things that were never fully his to carry, there was a pattern underneath it, a quiet exchange where he was consistently giving clarity, patience, and emotional steadiness, while receiving inconsistency, expectation, and subtle pressure in return. And for most of his life, he explained that imbalance away. He told himself that relationships required sacrifice, that understanding others was part of being a good man, that staying calm while someone else was unpredictable was a sign of strength. But at this stage of his life, those explanations started to feel incomplete because they never answered one simple question that kept returning to him. Why did being a good man so often require him to ignore his own internal signals? And that question changed everything because it forced him to look inward instead of outward, to examine not what others were doing, but what he had been allowing. And once he saw that clearly, once he realized that much of his exhaustion was self-permitted, not imposed, the idea of continuing the same patterns no longer felt noble, it felt unnecessary. And that realization is where the real shift begins, not in how he sees women, but in how he finally begins to see himself. What made the pattern impossible for Richard to ignore was not one dramatic failure. It was the consistency of small, almost invisible exchanges that all pointed in the same direction. And once he started paying attention, he could trace them back across years, across different people, across different situations that looked unique on the surface, but felt strangely identical underneath. Conversations where he would listen carefully, choose his words thoughtfully, try to keep things steady, while the response he received carried a different energy, less about understanding and more about expectation, less about mutual effort and more about what he was supposed to provide next. And for a long time he adapted to that without realizing it. He became the one who stabilized, the one who explained, the one who absorbed tension so that things would not fall apart. And in doing that, he slowly trained himself to tolerate dynamics that never truly felt balanced. Laura Bennett was not an exception to this pattern. She was simply the clearest example of it, because with her, Richard began to notice how often his presence was treated as something reliable rather than something valuable, as if his consistency was expected but not necessarily respected. And that distinction stayed with him, because it revealed something deeper than a single relationship. It showed him that being dependable had quietly turned into being taken for granted. And once a man recognizes that shift he sees that his effort is no longer creating connection, but maintaining imbalance. It becomes very difficult to continue pretending that nothing is wrong. What finally broke the illusion for Richard was the realization that trust had not disappeared all at once. It had been slowly worn down by moments so small they never seemed worth confronting at the time. A dismissive tone when he expressed something personal, a subtle shift in attention when he needed support, a pattern of conversations where his concerns were minimized while hers were treated as urgent and non-negotiable. And none of these moments were dramatic enough to justify walking away on their own, which is exactly why they were so powerful, because they accumulated quietly, building a kind of internal fatigue that no single conversation could resolve. And the more he reflected on it, the more he understood that what he had been calling patience was often just tolerance for imbalance. That what he had labeled as loyalty had sometimes been a reluctance to acknowledge uncomfortable truths. Laura did not create that realization. She revealed it because with her, the pattern became too consistent to ignore, too predictable to explain away. And that is when a shift deepened, because Richard stopped asking whether things could improve and started asking a different question entirely. What was the emotional cost of staying exactly where he was? And that question did not lead to anger. It led to clarity. Because once a man measures the cost of something honestly, he can no longer pretend that it is free. And for Richard, that cost was no longer something he was willing to keep paying without question. The moment that changed everything for Richard was not when he saw the pattern in others. It was when he finally saw the pattern in himself, because up until that point it was easy to believe that the problem existed somewhere outside of him, in the behavior of others, in the way relationships unfolded, in the unpredictability of people. But that belief quietly protected him from a harder truth. The fact that he had been consistently overriding his own instincts in order to keep things intact. And once he saw that clearly, once he recognized how many times he had felt something was off and chose to ignore it, how many times he had sensed imbalance and called it temporary, how many times he had adjusted himself instead of questioning the situation, the entire narrative shifted in a way that could not be undone, because it was no longer about what others had done to him. It was about what he had allowed to continue, and that realization did not come with anger. It came with a kind of quiet disappointment that felt heavier than anything else. Not disappointment in women, but disappointment in the version of himself that had kept choosing comfort over truth, that had mistaken endurance for strength. And that is the moment most people never talk about. The moment when a man stops focusing on who failed him and starts asking why he kept staying in situations that required him to abandon himself. Because once that question is asked honestly, there is no returning to who he was before, only a slow and deliberate movement toward becoming someone who no longer negotiates with his own clarity. After that realization, Richard did not make a dramatic announcement or a sudden exit. His life did not shift overnight in a way that anyone else could easily point to. Instead, the change showed up in quieter, more deliberate ways that only he fully understood. He began to pull his attention back from places where it was no longer respected. He stopped explaining himself in situations where clarity had never been valued. And most importantly, he started redirecting that energy towards something he had neglected for most of his life: himself, not in a loud or performative way, but in small, consistent actions that slowly rebuilt a sense of internal stability. His mornings became structured, his time became intentional, his boundaries became clearer not because he wanted to control others, but because he finally understood the cost of not protecting his own space. And as that shift continued, something unexpected happened. The need for external validation began to fade. Not completely, but enough that it no longer dictated his decisions. Because when a man begins to invest in his own growth with the same intensity he once gave to maintaining relationships, he starts to experience a different kind of return, one that is not dependent on someone else's response. And that changes how he moves through the world, not colder, not detached, but more grounded, more selective, and far less willing to trade his peace for temporary connection. As Richard continued down this path, he began to notice something that would have been impossible for him to recognize years earlier. The absence of chaos in his daily life started to feel more valuable than the presence of connection that came with conditions. His evenings became quieter, but also lighter, his thoughts clearer, his energy more consistent. And for the first time in a long time, he was not recovering from interactions. He was simply living, and that difference reshaped how he defined fulfillment, because he no longer measured his life by how needed he was, but by how stable he felt within himself. And that shift created a kind of freedom that does not look impressive from the outside, but feels undeniable from within. He was no longer pulled into conversations that required him to justify his boundaries, no longer drawn toward dynamics that demanded more than they returned, and most importantly, he no longer felt the urgency to fix, prove, or earn a place in someone else's life, because he had already secured his place in his own. And that is where many people misunderstand men like Richard. They assume distance means disconnection, but in reality, what has happened is a refinement, a filtering process where only what aligns with his values and preserves his peace is allowed to remain, and everything else, no matter how familiar, simply no longer fits into the life he has consciously chosen to build. By the time Richard reached this point, the narrative that once defined his life no longer applied, because he was no longer operating from the same assumptions that had guided him for decades. He was not trying to rebuild what he had stepped away from. He was building something entirely different, something that did not require him to compromise his clarity in order to maintain connection. And that is the part most people fail to understand. They assume that when a man steps back like this, he is closing himself off from the world. But what is actually happening is far more intentional. He is no longer participating in dynamics that cost him more than they give, and that decision is not rooted in fear. It is rooted in self-respect, because after a lifetime of observing, adjusting, and enduring, he has finally reached a place where he trusts his own judgment more than he trusts the promises or potential of others. And that shift changes everything. It changes how he listens, how he responds, how he chooses who and what he allows into his life, and most importantly, it changes what he is willing to walk away from without explanation. Because for the first time, he understands that protecting his peace is not selfish, it is necessary. And that understanding becomes the foundation of everything that follows, not isolation, not resentment, but a quiet, steady commitment to living a life that no longer requires him to abandon himself in order to feel connected.